Publisher's note: this is a companion piece to Slum. I never liked Rustic Gables Skilled Nursing Facility. Years ago, I worked as an EMT for Meditrans ambulance service. We did interfacility transports, mostly dialysis runs and hospital discharges, so I spent a lot of time around crappy nursing homes. But even with my bar set as low as it was, Rustic Gables S&F still managed to underwhelm. The 4-story building itself put off an air of hostility. Near 6th and Alvarado in a slummy corner of Westlake, Rustic Gables S&F sat like a diseased tooth, a squat, square, filthy white structure jutting out of a narrow, uneven parking lot surrounded by a 14-foot fence. Inside, Rustic Gables was, well, exactly how you'd expect. The residents were crammed 4 to a 2-small room. Every August, half the ancient window air units broke down. Their 1.5-star rating was on display over the reception desk, and I'm pretty sure they only managed the extra half-star because someone knew how to BS the inspector. The faceless healthcare conglomerate that owned the place had bought the property from a bank auction. I'd never leave anyone I loved at Rustic Gables S&F. Rustic Gables burned through nurses like cheap cigarettes. It seemed like every time I approached a nursing station, I was greeted by a different young woman in stained scrubs. Meanwhile, my partner and I would run into ex-Rustic Gables employees everywhere we went: dialysis centers, hospitals, other S&Fs. It was rumored that Rustic Gables was haunted. Stories were told of eerie voices behind patients' closed doors, of strangers seen wandering the halls, of objects moving by themselves, and of staff members somehow teleporting themselves all over the facility without realizing it. I heard more than one tale in which the teller swore they'd seen a nurse walk into a patient's room, fail to reappear, then be found on the next floor up, swearing she hadn't been near the patient's room in hours. Once a patient had been killed when a nurse gave her a second dose of metoprolol, sending her into hypovolemic shock. The guilty nurse swore that she'd spoken to the medical director, in person, and that he'd given her orders for the extra dose. That was obviously bullshit. The medical director had been in his office, miles away, with multiple witnesses, but the nurse was insistent, even after she'd pled guilty to avoid jail time. I highly doubted that incident was the work of ghosts. A hangover was a more likely culprit, but even the most skeptical of the ex-nurses agreed they'd gotten a bad vibe working at Rustic Gables, especially at night. In early, my wife Lily told me she'd gotten a job at Rustic Gables S&F. I warned her that everybody who worked there hated the place, and offered to continue paying the lion's share of our bills until she could find other employment. "You want me to say fuck you to a full-time nursing job with benefits?" she snapped, squishing her mouth into a pissy little bow. "I'm sick of working at Subway. Do you honestly think anyone else is going to offer me anything with no experience?" She had me there. The oversaturated medical job market of Los Angeles was a tough spot for a recently graduated licensed vocational nurse, especially in the middle of a recession. "I get it," I told her, "but I'm making enough money now, and I don't think you're going to like Rustic Gables much. People say it's haunted, and you hate horror." Lily flashed me a condescending, pursed-lipped smile. She knew I hated that smile. She was a tiny girl, my wife, barely 5 feet tall, and maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. Her eyes were opal-shaped and deep-set in her square face. She had long, dark, silky hair. A clump of it fell over an eye. "But you're not making enough money, Cyrus," she chirped, as though I were a retarded kindergartner. "And I'd rather hang out with Casper the Friendly Ghost than ask my dad for money. Again." I closed my eyes and counted to 10. She was baiting me. Her parents didn't like me much, because I didn't have a college degree, and my parents were alcoholic white trash. And her father had loaned us money twice in the last year. Once the previous January, when we signed the lease and had to cough up first and deposit for our microscopic Koreatown 1-bedroom, and once in August, when my car broke down. "Fine, Lil," I said through clenched teeth. "Do what you want." With that, I went to shower and get ready for bed. Our marriage was doomed. We both knew it, but neither of us had the balls to give that final nail in the coffin the mighty whack it needed. Lily took the job. A couple days later, during her second training shift, my partner Rivera and I were sent to Rustic Gables to pick up a patient who, of course, lived on the first floor, where Lily was stationed. Our patient was a bed-confined octogenarian going to St. Vincent for a G-tube placement. It should have been a quick, drama-free call, but the nurses didn't have the paperwork done yet. Lily was being a complete asshole about it, hanging over the shoulder of the charge nurse, smiling her noxious pursed-lip smile as her new friend berated us over the pickup time, as though it were our fault they didn't have their shit together. Rivera went to the ambulance to charge his phone. I'd grit my teeth so hard my skull hurt, and a half glance at Lily's haughty profile was enough to propel bolts of pain up my jaw. For the sake of professionalism and my sanity, I walked away. I wandered to the mismatched front lobby, and there I found a shriveled old woman with dyed orange hair, curled up on a stained couch. A nasal cannula dangled from her face, attached to an oxygen canister on the back of a rickety wheelchair. Her eyes snapped open. When she saw me, her face fell. "How are you, ma'am?" I asked weakly. "Do you need help?" She mumbled something, her voice weak. I hunched beside her and asked her to repeat what she'd said. "I'm waiting for Scott." I looked around. "Is Scott your nurse? I can find him if you want." She shook her head sadly. "He comes here, at night. He talks to me. I've got to stay here or I won't see him." I breathed in and found that the lobby had a weird smell to it. Kind of rotten, but kind of sweet, like the funk that filled our station when the shared fridge was opened. The orange-haired lady didn't seem bothered by it, but I was relieved to see Rivera round the corner, paperwork in hand. I came home after Lily. She pretended to be asleep. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. Perfect situation, I thought. Now we never have to talk. A couple weeks later, my company picked up another dialysis patient out of Rustic Gables SNF. Soon, Rivera and I were sent to get him. On the way in, I spotted the same orange-haired woman on the same stained couch, still waiting for Scott. The new dialysis patient, let's call him Herbert Smith, was 79 and not doing well. He was bedbound due to the lingering effects of a stroke, half-blind and atrophied. He looked in my general direction when I called his name, but responded to all further inquiries with incomprehensible muttering. His room, happily, was on the 3rd floor, which put a whole story between me and Lily. We got him loaded in the ambulance, and after a set of vitals, I took advantage of the 15-minute drive to Western Dialysis to finish some paperwork. Herbert Smith stared mindlessly ahead, seemingly unaware of my presence. Then, he mumbled something. I looked up from my writing. "What's that, Herbert?" I asked loudly. "The one-legged man talks to me," he repeated. I leaned in. "Who talks to you, Herbert?" "The Oriental man, the man with one leg. He comes into my room at night." Herbert's milky eyes were unfocused, staring vacuously into some point between the road and the ceiling of the ambulance. "The Oriental man, huh?" I pressed indulgently. "He's angry with me," Herbert continued, speaking to oblivion. "He knows I left him. I wish he'd go away." That night, I came home to every light in the apartment on and Lily in the kitchen, making a cup of tea. This was a surprise, as she'd gotten into the habit of feigning sleep. On the rare occasions she'd exchanged a few words with me, she'd done so with a constipated pout, as though my presence was physically painful. "You're still awake, Lil?" I asked without thinking. I immediately realized the stupidity of the question and braced for the sarcastic answer, but the nasty remark didn't come. "Yeah," Lily replied nonchalantly. "I have a headache." She looked at me. For the first time in a while, I didn't see contempt in her eyes. I realized all of a sudden that I no longer remembered how to act around Lily without picking a fight or continuing one. Then I thought of something. "Lily," I asked, "the old woman who's always on the chair by the door, with the bright orange hair and the oxygen, who is she?" Lily frowned. "Her name's Greta. She's in my station. She's pretty far gone." "I talked to her," I said. "She said she was waiting for Scott." "Oh, I know." Lily shook her head. "Scott's not coming. He was Greta's son. He died of cancer 5 years ago. There are pictures of him all around her room." This piece of information jolted me. I remembered the look in Greta's eyes when I'd woken her. Pure happiness, then immediate disappointment when she realized I was not, in fact, her long-deceased child. Poor old bird. Dementia's a bitch. I'd thought that night was a fluke, as far as my and Lily's relationship was concerned. Lily, tired and in pain, hadn't had the energy to antagonize me. But the next night, I came home to her awake again, and decidedly unantagonistic. And the next, and the next. One night, I came home to find her huddled on the couch, shaking, the glow from the muted TV illuminating her tears. My first impulse was to run. I'd long forgotten how to comfort Lily. But I'm not an impulsive person. What came next was the first honest conversation we'd had in months. Lily had been on edge for weeks. Work was the problem. Her shifts at Rustic Gables had become both physically and mentally unbearable, for reasons she couldn't justify to herself, let alone anybody else. As soon as I walk in, my chest tightens up and I start feeling weak, she said. I'm scared of something, but I don't know what it is. And whenever I'm alone, I hear things. Little noises behind me. But when I turn, there's nothing there. I reiterated that she could leave, that I'd pay the bills, and that I'd known other nurses who'd left because the place was too creepy. But Lily shook her head decisively. She wasn't batshit, and if she quit after working at Rustic Gables for barely a month, she'd appear flaky. The next day was Herbert Smith's dialysis day, and Rivera and I were the crew sent to pick him up. The young nurse on duty told me he was being showered. We'd have to wait a few minutes. I considered going to find Lily. Then I was drawn to a feature of Herbert Smith's room I hadn't noticed. There was a bulletin board on the wall parallel to his bed, and someone had pinned up several old newspaper clippings. I looked closer. Herbert had been a medic during the Korean War. One article, titled "Wounded Hero Welcomed Home," described his commendable service. He'd found a young soldier with a chest wound lying on a path. All of a sudden, bullets started flying around them. He pulled the soldier into a ditch, patched him up, and waited with him until they were found by an American platoon. While Herbert was hailed as a hero, he had regrets about the incident. He'd seen another man, a Korean villager, lying on the ground with a nasty wound in his leg. The man was writhing but too weak to remove himself from danger. Herbert had been conflicted, but he could still hear gunshots, and following protocol, he stayed put. By the time help arrived, the Korean man had died. The article included pictures taken by a soldier in the platoon. In one of them, you could just make out the face of the dead Korean in the background. I remembered Herbert's comments about the Oriental man with one leg, the one who he hadn't gone back for. As long as I'd known him, Herbert hadn't looked great, but I was surprised at just how severely his health had deteriorated. His atrophied limbs had become skeletal, his skin was translucent, and he'd lost hair. His cloudy eyes didn't even flicker as we lifted him from his bed to the gurney. I drove that day. Rivera sat in the back with Herbert. As we wheeled the old man in, I asked Rivera if he'd said anything strange in the back. Rivera gave me a weird look. He wasn't aware Herbert could speak at all. Herbert was completely unresponsive as we placed him in his dialysis chair. He slumped to one side. We propped him up with a pillow. While Rivera chased a tech for a signature, I wrapped the blood pressure cuff attached to the dialysis machine around Herbert's arm. Before I knew what was happening, Herbert Smith was clutching my bicep. I jumped. The old man kept hold, his grip stronger than his spindly fingers should have allowed. His milky white eyes bored into mine. The Oriental man says he's going to take me with him. I wrenched my arm out of his grasp. Herbert went limp and flopped over. I called his name, but his ashen face drooped dumbly and his liquid eyes were dull. Whoever had spoken to me was logged off, signed out, no longer in the building. 45 minutes into dialysis, Herbert violently tore the blood-filled tubes from his arm. The staff attempted to stop the bleeding, but he fought them off with an alarming level of ferocity. It was said that Herbert Smith never looked so peaceful as he had while being carried out by paramedics, already into irreversible shock. He died before they made it to the hospital. I remained ignorant as this was going on. Rivera and I ran a few more calls. I drove in and out of hospital parking lots, pondering Herbert's Korean ghost. Later, at around 6, I received a text from Lily. That was hot sigh. It was a weird thing to say. I assumed she meant our conversation the night before, responded with a single smiley face, and thought about it all afternoon. For months, I'd wanted Lily gone. I'd fantasized about coming home and discovering she'd moved out. But when I read that text, I felt a little twinge of the ecstasy she'd inspired in me when we were 18 and obsessed with each other. As soon as I walked into our apartment, Lily jumped me. Wordlessly, passionately, we made love on the couch. Her perfume, her red lipstick, her hair tickling my skin was intoxicating. It was instinctive, animalistic. When we finished, we lay entangled on the couch, strands of her hair still in my mouth. That was amazing, I muttered to her. I'm so glad we did that. You started it, she teased, running her hand across my chest. That was a pretty hot kiss. The charge nurse was pissed, but it was worth it. What's the charge nurse got to do with anything? I asked innocently. Lily pulled away. She sat up. You came to see me at Rustic Gables. You kissed me, right in front of the other nurses. I went cold. Lily, I said, I didn't do that. I was at Rustic Gables in the morning to pick up Mr. Smith, but I didn't see you at all. I didn't kiss you. She forced a laugh. Sigh, stop fucking joking. Unless you've got a twin I don't know about, you kissed me today. The other nurses all saw. I don't know what to tell you, Lil, I said. I was on the 3rd floor for like 15 minutes, then in the ambulance the rest of the day. Lily glared. Shoving me out of the way, she grabbed her clothes and stood up. "Fuck you, Cyrus. You're a fucking liar." With that, she stomped to our bedroom and slammed the door. In the morning, she was gone before I woke up. The whole thing bothered me. Apparently, Lily had been passionately kissed in front of her coworkers by a guy who looked just like me. I'd long suspected she had undiagnosed bipolar disorder, but I might have been wrong. Maybe undiagnosed schizophrenia. 2 days later, Rivera and I were sent for Herbert Smith. The nurse at Rustic Gables told us he was dead. Rivera went to call dispatch and tell them that, in fact, our services were not needed. I waited with the gurney in the front lobby. Orange-haired Greta was curled up on the couch, presumably still waiting for Scott. Poor lady. I tried to catch her eye, but she was oblivious to my presence. Then I saw tears running down her face. I would have gone to talk to her if a hand hadn't jerked my arm. I whirled around and found myself face to face with Lily. Her eyes were puffy and bloodshot. She was pissed. "There you are," she snapped. "What the fuck, Cyrus? You're messing with me now?" "Lily, what are you talking about? I heard you calling my name," she said, unable to control the tremble in her voice. "Down the hall. In that fucking creepy voice. Where were you hiding? Under a bed or something?" "Lily, I didn't do that. I've been here." "It was your voice," Lily insisted. "Saying, 'Lily, come to me.' I was handing out meds and I heard you. I'm so sick of your fucking jokes." "Lily, I started. "Fuck you, Cyrus. I want a divorce." With that, she stomped back to the nurse's station. I didn't go after her. I stood there, useless, fuming. All the anger and resentment I'd been nursing for months, the frustration of never, ever being good enough for Lily swirled around me like a tornado. I wanted her dead. I wanted to wrap my fingers around her neck and stare into her protruding eyes until they glazed over. If Rivera hadn't come to tell me that we had another call, I'm not sure what I would have done. We spent the rest of the night with one of the respiratory therapists, wedging a pound, ventilator-dependent vegetable onto our gurney and driving him to a crappy post-acute inn, Silmar. As we drove back to the station, I saw I had missed 2 calls from Lily and that she'd left me a voice message. I ignored it. Even thinking about her jacked my blood pressure. Lily didn't come home that night, and I was relieved. The next morning, I was dismayed to see the address of Rustic Gables flash across our pager. We were picking up a psych patient, an old lady with dementia wigging out, going to the Brotman psychiatric ward. The name of the patient, Greta, the orange-haired lady in the lobby, always waiting for Scott. It started a little after midnight, the charge nurse told me. All of a sudden she was screaming and crying. I'd never heard anything like it, just this anguished, otherworldly wailing. Had she had any change in medications recently? I asked. The nurse shook her head. Her son Scott died about 5 years ago. She was very devoted to him, and she'd been telling some of the nurses that he comes and sees her at night. I nodded sympathetically. "Anyways," the nurse continued, "last night, she kept on screaming Scott's name over and over. We got her into bed and gave her a sleeping pill, but it didn't take. She woke up around 3, dragged herself out of bed and into the hallway. We found her pawing at the door of a storage closet. They had Greta restrained to the bed, unnecessarily so, I thought, as whatever sedative they'd given her had reduced her to a near comatose state. We moved her onto the gurney without issue. But in the back of the ambulance, she squirmed around and opened her eyes. She threw a languid look my direction. "So Greta," I said kindly, hoping my voice would keep her quiet, "how are you doing today? Have the nurses been treating you good?" "Scott came to me," she said emotionlessly. The words hit me like a punch. "Let's not talk about Scott, okay?" "He was burning," Greta continued, as though she hadn't heard me. "His face was melting. He was screaming in pain." Tears welled in her eyes. Then it wasn't Scott anymore. It was this monster, this demon. And he told me that's what Scott looked like in hell. She sobbed. I might have said something comforting. If I did, it had no effect. I don't remember. At that moment, I had never been more disturbed in my entire life. Greta didn't speak again. She just cried, tears and snot collecting in her wrinkles. She cried all the way to Brotman and kept on crying as we waited for her room to be ready. We heard her moans as we pulled our gurney down the 6th floor hall until the elevator doors closed. Lily didn't come home that night. Days passed. I was given no clue as to her whereabouts. I called a few times, but her phone was off. I should have been concerned that she left so much of her stuff in the apartment. But she had her ID and bank cards. She had plenty of scrubs stowed at her parents' house in Rosemead. and I assumed no one in her family was fond enough of me to call. Finally, a week later, Rivera and I were sent back to Rustic Gables. I don't remember who or what we were supposed to pick up. We were walking through the little lobby, noticing Greta's absence, when I felt hands around my waist. Tiny, perfectly manicured hands. Lily stood behind me, looking happier than she had in a year. Rivera shook his head playfully and told me he'd meet me on the second floor. When he was gone, Lily took me by the hand and led me away, towards the back door, which was only ever used by nurses sneaking a smoke, down a narrow hallway I'd never noticed, which extended to the left of the back door and dead-ended. "Lil," I said, "where have you been?" I was starting to get worried. She stopped pulling and turned around, holding me close. She wrapped her arms around my neck, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed me passionately. "I've been with a friend," she murmured into my ear. "I miss you, Cyrus." She kissed me again, then pulled away and resumed tugging my hand with surprising strength. She stopped in front of a nondescript little closet, across from the janitor's storage. "Make love to me, Cyrus," she breathed, her voice thick and sultry. "I know a special place." She reached for the doorknob. As soon as she let go of my hand, my senses came crashing back down to earth. "Lil," I said kindly, "I've got to pick up a patient. Come home tonight, we'll talk then." She gazed into my eyes with a come-hither smile. For some reason, this freaked me out. Maybe because her mouth seemed to extend a little too far into her cheeks. Or maybe because, in the 6 years we'd been a couple, Lily had never once used the phrase, "make love to me." One way or another, my weird radar blipped, and with one more "come home tonight, Lil," I escaped to the elevator. "Cyrus," Lily called after me. I didn't turn around. On the second floor, I found Rivera talking to a squat Korean woman I recognized as the first-floor head nurse, Lily's supervisor. The nurse glared when she saw me. "Hey you," she said gruffly, "you're Lily's husband, right?" I nodded, inviting the catty comment. "Where's your wife been?" she asked. "Her phone's dead. She hasn't shown up for work in a week." She's here," I said. "She's downstairs. I just talked to her." The nurse shook her head. "Well, I haven't seen her all day, and I just left the desk 5 minutes ago. She hasn't clocked in since the 12th. I was confused. I told the nurse something, then ran down the stairs to the first floor, dead set on finding Lily and proving her presence. I'd kissed her. I'd felt her arms around me. So either she was deliberately messing with her boss, or else her boss was crazy. Or I was crazy. No one was at the first-floor nurse's desk. I paced the halls, peeking into rooms. Nothing. No Lily. Then I thought of something. She hadn't clocked in since the 12th. The 12th of February. That sounded familiar. I checked my phone. The last missed call from Lily had occurred on the 12th of February. That was the day she'd chased me down in the lobby, accused me of calling her name in a creepy voice, demanded a divorce. I saw the voicemail icon, and recalled she had left me a message that day. I dialed my voicemail, deleted a few messages, and then I heard my wife's voice. Her sobbing, panicked, terrified voice. "Cyrus," she breathed. "Cyrus, I know you're not here, but I keep on hearing your voice, and I saw you again. But it wasn't you, because your face was all blurry. Then you walked into the closet and disappeared. Is this a joke? Please fucking tell me this is a..." She gasped, and I heard the phone drop. Then a muffled male voice. A voice that sounded terrifyingly familiar, saying something like, "found you." Then I heard another voice. My wife's voice, calling my name. But it wasn't coming from my phone. "Cyrus, Cyrus." I followed the voice. It was coming from the back entrance, from the direction of the closet Lily had tried to drag me into. As I approached, I remembered what I'd been told about old Greta. She'd freaked out, and they'd found her pawing at a closet door. Had it been this door? I turned the knob. I flicked on the light switch. I found myself staring at a tiny, dusty storage room, seemingly used as a dumping ground for cardboard boxes and broken equipment. The floor was peeling linoleum, and cobwebs hung from 2 cheap metal shelves. A healthy coating of dust told me this room was rarely accessed by the nursing staff. I heard it again. "Cyrus! Cyrus!" Then was hit with the dizzying realization that the voice was coming from under the floor. Anyone with the IQ of a monkey could tell you I should have bailed. That a disembodied voice calling my name, beneath the floor on the first story of a building, was not a phenomenon I should investigate alone. But somewhere between my softcore script conversation with Lily and her gut-churning message on my phone, I stopped thinking logically. I looked around. No doors, no stairs, and I knew there wasn't a basement button on the elevators. Then I saw it. Under one of the shelves, a trapdoor, and a small black object. I knelt to look. A Motorola Razr, with a Hello Kitty bauble and a small crack to the bottom left of the screen. Lily's phone. This discovery turbocharged my nervous system. I stood up, grabbed the shelf and pulled. With a loud boom, the metal structure pivoted. I examined the trapdoor. It was latched and fastened with a dusty, rusted lock. Lily's voice, louder, floated up from below. "Cyrus, come find me, Cyrus." Using my pocket knife, I easily picked the ancient lock. Then I lifted. I saw darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I saw stairs. Damp, rotting wooden stairs leading down to some sort of cellar. I breathed in and gagged. The musty, earthy smell was overpowering. It was the smell of a wooden shed after the rain, mixed with the smell of a compost heap, mixed with a smell reminiscent of the family of possums that had gotten trapped under my mother's mobile home one December, died and rotted until spring. "Cyrus!" Lily cried again. This time she sounded agitated, scared. I took a deep breath, then descended. I proceeded cautiously, cell phone in one hand, pocket knife clutched in the other, step by step. By the pale blue light of my cell screen, I saw the floor was dirt. I made out a dark blotch that must have been a puddle, and I heard faint dripping. The walls were gray cinder block with black designs painted on them. Then my feeble light fell on a woman with blue scrubs and long black hair. "Lily. Lil," I cried out. "Lily, what the fuck are you doing?" "Shh." She put her finger to her lips as she approached out of the darkness. Then I was standing on the earthen floor, and she was close. Close enough for me to see that her features weren't right. Her eyes were too small. Her nose was too flat. She took my hands. Her features shifted, blurring in and out of focus. Was it an effect of the light seeping in through the trapdoor? Were my eyes still adjusting? And why had Lily, of all places, chosen? And then her mouth was against my mouth. I couldn't eat for 3 days. I felt her warm tongue dissolve in my mouth, turn cold and dead, break into icy chunks that tasted like dust and stringed cabbage and rotting fish, expanding in my throat, choking me. I pulled away, coughing and sputtering and trying to scream. I dropped my phone. As I dry heaved, I heard Lily's laughter. Now it sounded distant. Without thinking, I stood up. My phone had landed in the puddle, creating an inverted spotlight. A body, noose around its neck, hung from the rafters. Immobilized by terror, I was forced to take in every detail. Blue scrubs, feet dangling lifelessly, claw-like hands, plaster still in rigor mortis, long black hair, purple cheeks, open mouth, swollen tongue dripping dark saliva, bloodshot opal eyes protruding like a demented cartoon character's, staring into oblivion. Lily, dead, Lily. I don't know how long I stared at my dead wife hanging from the ceiling before I felt the hand on my shoulder. Jolted from my traumatized paralysis, I turned around. Illuminated by the light from the open trapdoor was me. My mirror image stood in front of me. While Lily's doppelganger had flitted in and out of focus, mine was explicitly grossly exact in every last detail. The little hairs on my unshaved cheeks, the red pimple on my forehead, the scar at the corner of my eye from when I fell off my bike during one of my second stepfather's drunken rampages. My smile was malicious, triumphant. Then it spoke, in a twisted, modulated mockery of my voice. "Aren't you going to say thank you?" Then it started to melt. I don't remember much after that. I heard my own voice screaming. Whether it was me or my putrefying doppelganger, I don't care to find out. There were more voices, women's screams, rough hands on me, an arm around my shoulders leading me up, then sunlight, then sirens. Lily had been dead for more than a week. That's what the police officers told me, the second time I was questioned. The types of questions they were asking, I was sure they were going to pin it on me, especially given the nature of my and Lily's relationship. But they didn't. In the end, they ruled her death a suicide. She'd died by strangulation, though they didn't know how she'd managed it. She must have found the rope already hanging from the rafters. The cellar was 14 feet high. There was no way she'd have been able to climb up and tie it herself. Nor could they find the chair or stool she had jumped off. They didn't know how she had found the basement. None of the nurses knew the dirt-floored cellar even existed. When the healthcare corporation had bought and gutted the place, they'd left the back of the first floor as it was. No attention had been paid to the sad little closet, and no one could explain how she'd gotten down into the basement in the first place. There was only one entrance, the trapdoor. The trapdoor I'd found, locked from the outside. Even with the coroner's report, the cops had trouble pinning down a timeline. Lily had gone missing on the 12th, of that the head nurse was adamant. I insisted I had seen her, alive, on the day her body was found. Rivera backed me up. We weren't alone. Another nurse had had a conversation with Lily on the TH. She remembered the date because it was the day after Valentine's Day. And a patient claimed he hadn't actually seen Lily, as it had been dark and his eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but had heard her voice singing him to sleep. This one was particularly strange, because the night the old man had allegedly been sung to sleep by Lily was a good 2 weeks after she died, and a week after her decomposing body had been recovered. The cops wrote him off as confused, but I'm not so sure. I left town after Lily's funeral. My father in Bakersfield, with whom I hadn't spoken in years, called out of the blue and invited me to stay with him. When the flashbacks stopped and the memories scarred over, I screwed my head back on and went to paramedic school. I found a job, ran the Baker to Vegas stretch for a few years, then decided to take the next step in my career. I only applied to LA City Fire because it was ultra competitive and I assumed I'd fail the psychiatric exam. When my new hire packet came in the mail, I picked it up off the porch with trembling hands. I wanted to say no, but La City was the job a million guys would kill for, and my dad told me he'd knock me out, throw me in the back of his truck, and leave me on the station steps if he had to. I moved back to Los Angeles in March of this year. I didn't know anyone. I'd lost touch with all my old FR. I suffer from a condition called Charles Bonnet syndrome, or visual release hallucinations if you want to get more technical. It's a condition that's far more common than you might realize. It's estimated that as many as half of people with gradual loss of vision will experience one or more bouts over their lifetime. Yet I'm willing to bet that most of you have never heard of it. The reason for that is because most sufferers are scared to tell anybody what we experience. I know I was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Andrew and I'm 2 years ago I woke up with awful blurred vision, every single edge and detail clouded as if somebody had smeared Vaseline on a camera lens. It never got better. I was scared then, and got over to Dr. Harper's surgery as fast as I could, suddenly needing to take a cab rather than climb in the car I'd driven without incident ever since I'd bought it 3 years prior. The doctor did some tests, asked me some questions. Have you been much thirstier lately? How often do you urinate? How would you describe your tiredness levels? And then gave me the diagnosis that changed my life forever. Diabetes, type 1. He explained that I would need to take insulin shots with every meal, that eating the wrong foods without monitoring my blood sugar could see me drop into a coma, or worse. Then he got to my eyes. Andrew, your diabetes has resulted in maculopathy. Do you know what that is? I shook my head dumbly, already reeling with the shock of my diagnosis, and Dr. Harper went on. It's when the diabetes affects the blood vessels at the back of your eye, blocking them and causing them to leak into the macula, the central part of your retina that helps you to perceive color and fine detail. When these blood vessels leak into the macula, it can cause significant damage. With a lump in my throat, I asked, "Okay, so how do we make this better?" I couldn't see Harper's face properly when he spoke, but his tone of voice was enough to tell me what I'd been dreading. "I'm sorry, Andrew," he replied gravely. "Perhaps if we'd caught this a little sooner, we might have had some treatment options available to us, but I'm afraid the damage has been pretty extensive. We can take steps to arrest the development of the condition, but I'm afraid it's irreversible." I felt as if my world had come crashing down around me. I was just still at my physical peak. I was active, playing basketball and cycling a couple of times a week, and now my health, my body, and my sight had been taken from me. The first 6 months were tough. I broke up with my girlfriend, a sweet girl called Holly, who tried to make it work, but couldn't because I was so damn angry all the time. I lost my job, because if there's one thing an architect needs, it's his eyes. I even fell out with a lot of my friends, making excuses to not meet with them until they stopped asking. In truth, it was jealousy on my part, envy that they got to keep on living, while everything I'd ever hoped for had been snatched away. I became a recluse, never leaving my apartment, barely bothering to wash, shave, or get dressed each day. I was so sure that my life was over, I stopped even trying to live it. I was an asshole. It took me a long time to realize this, but in the end, it was the nurse assigned to visit me at home, a tall, no-nonsense, experienced woman called Lois, who brought this to my attention. "You're an asshole," she said. "What?" I gasped, shocked at her language. "So you've got diabetes. Do you know how many people do?" she asked then, before waiting for my answer. She continued, "Do you think they all hide in their apartments, refusing to get on with their lives? Losing your vision is a terrible thing and you do have my sympathy, but, Andrew, it's no excuse to give up. But you don't, I argued, trying to defend myself, but she hadn't finished. Understand, she growled. One of the bravest men I know was paralyzed from the neck down when he was just a child, and he hasn't given up. You can do so much more with your life, and you have people that want to help you do that. But you can't even be bothered to shave that ugly fucking beard off. Stop being a crybaby and make a fucking difference. Of course, it didn't happen overnight, and I argued with her. I was furious at her blunt insensitivity and told her to leave. I said I'd tell her superiors, but she laughed and told me I wouldn't. You won't because you're a smart guy and you've got too much pride for that, she said. I'll see you next week. That night I shaved. I opened my curtains and actually looked around. Things were blurry, but when I really looked, I could see the things scattered around my home, the mess I'd let it become. When Lois came back the following week, the place was tidy. I was clean-shaven, dressed. I'd even attempted to comb my hair. She didn't say anything about it, didn't mention the argument of the week before, but she took me out for coffee down the street. She guided me along the sidewalk to the coffee shop, talking to me, reassuring me. It was daunting, even though it was less than a block away, but I felt so proud when I got there. We talked, me and Lois. I think I even laughed. Afterwards, she walked me home. Then, when she helped me back inside, she said, "It's nice to meet you at last, Andrew." That day was the beginning of my new life. I moved to a new apartment, a ground floor place, and joined a group of other young people with visual impairments. I made friends. I got out every day, even if it was just a short walk, but I made a point of seeing what I could of the world. I bought what I could, but the Sawyers, the old couple that ran the local store, would bring my groceries by once a week. Clark's a gruff old coot, so he refuses to coddle me, and he's told me that he respects me for being like I am, for maintaining my independence, for not giving up. From a guy like him, that's one of the sweetest things I've ever heard. Things were going so well. And then, 1 year ago, it started. I walked into my living room, a mug of coffee in my hand, and I saw a Victorian funeral carriage stood right there on my rug, complete with 2 huge, proud horses in full livery, adorned with long black plumes in their bridles. They stood perfectly still, while the driver, a small bearded man in period costume and a top hat, fidgeted with the reins and peered at me expectantly. Bizarrely, they were far clearer than the usual blurry shapes that I could see. I damn near pissed my pants. I dropped the cup, spilling scalding hot coffee over my bare feet, jumping backwards with a cry of pain and alarm. When I returned my attention to the horses and carriage back in the room, they were gone. At that moment, I wondered if I was going mad. Apparently, most of us do, which is understandable. How would you feel if you'd seen that exact same sight in your home? Unless you're Jack the Ripper, I imagine many of you do not have a coach and horses just lying around. I certainly didn't. Eventually, after much quiet swearing to myself and more than a little self-delusion, I managed to convince myself that I had not seen what I thought I had, that it was merely a very vivid daydream. This seemed to work, and I got on with living, even if I entered that same room a little more cautiously in the days that followed. Finally, I forgot about it. 2 weeks later, I saw a giant, floating, swirling orange ball in my bathroom. I damn near pissed myself again. I stood staring at it, this bizarre, rotating, levitating globe that was a little larger than a beach ball hanging in midair over my tub, open-mouthed for a full 10 seconds, before finally screwing my eyelids tightly closed and whispering to myself, "That isn't there. That isn't there." After 5 seconds, I opened my eyes again. It wasn't there. Have you ever had cause to doubt your own sanity, to wonder whether what you perceive is truly there, or if your mind has betrayed you? Honestly, compared to the loss of my vision, the prospect of losing my wits was so much more terrifying. I'd fought against adversity and took pride in the fact that I am not just a survivor, but somebody who is living his own life. How could I do that if I was insane? I barely slept that night, and I remained jumpy for days afterwards. Any sign of movement or any unfamiliar shape would set my pulse racing, would cause me to doubt whether it was truly there. It was the toughest time I'd ever been through, worse even than that time after I was diagnosed with diabetes. At least when Dr. Harper had told me about the diabetes, I had a definitive prognosis. I was given facts by a medical professional. My affliction was physical, it had a name, and most important, it had a treatment plan. This was something else. My own mind had turned against me. My senses and perception of reality had become twisted and unreliable. It's only when you're in that position that you realize just how terrifying it is. Your senses and the way in which your brain interprets them are your only true defenses against danger. You perceive danger and you avoid it, preventing your body from becoming harmed. But what happens when you can't trust your perception to alert you to dangers that are truly there? Lois picked up the problem first, noticing my skittish manner. She asked what was wrong, if I needed to talk about anything, but I told her no, I was fine, but I hadn't been sleeping well. That last part was true. I hadn't been able to sleep a wink. Just the very thought of being institutionalized, spending the rest of my days a sedated, blue pajamas-clad zombie in a white room, with only the echoing cries of my fellow inmates for company, terrified me beyond measure. But what was the alternative? Live life as a risk to myself and others? Ultimately, I chose to ignore it. I reasoned that if I was able to function around other people without them realizing what was going on, that was good enough. A full month passed before the next incident, and I really did think that maybe I'd put this whole mess behind me. With every passing day, my confidence had grown, so that Wednesday morning I'd stepped out onto the sunny street feeling pretty carefree. Each Wednesday I'd treat myself to a latte down at Joe's, the same coffee shop that I'd visited with Lois. It was a custom that gave me a great deal of pleasure, one that had seen me forge friendships with other regulars as well as the staff, including Joe himself. As I made my way down the street, white stick in hand, I glanced about me, taking in the colors and shapes of the world around me. I enjoyed the feel of the sun on my face and the sounds of the birds singing. It was a good day. Then I saw them, a party of pilgrims, 6 of them, all dressed in settler-era attire, sitting cross-legged on the asphalt. They didn't look at me. Instead, they were engaged in a heated, yet strangely silent, conversation. I froze, staring at them. Still they argued, gesticulating furiously at one another. However, I couldn't hear their angry voices, despite the fact that, judging by their ill temperament, they must be screaming at one another. Paralyzed by shock, the white stick fell from my numb fingers, clattering onto the sidewalk. I turned to leave, desperate to flee from the haunting sight of the colonists in the road, but I was so panicked, in such a hurry, that I stepped on my cane. It rolled underfoot, and before I knew it, I pitched over, tumbling to the hard ground below. I didn't quite break my fall in time, banging my cheek hard on the floor and skinning my palms. I heard a cry from a passerby, a friendly, concerned woman who rushed to my side. She knelt beside me, helping me up, applying a Kleenex to my throbbing cheek, which she informed me was now bleeding. I tried to tell her that I was okay. There was nothing to worry about, but this good Samaritan insisted on driving me to Dr. Harper's office to get my injuries looked at. Now I think back to it, I'm pretty sure that she knew my obvious distress was nothing to do with the fall. At the time, I was embarrassed and angry, but now I realize I owe her a debt of gratitude. Without her intervention, I don't know how much longer this would have gone on before I cracked up and ended up in an asylum after breaking down through sheer stress. Andrew, why don't you tell me what happened? Dr. Harper asked, gently dabbing at my cheek with disinfectant. I explained that I'd just lost my balance and that no harm was done, but I think he saw through my feeble protestations to my underlying agitation. He didn't press or force the matter. He simply asked what might have caused my clumsiness. Then he asked how I'd been as of late. When I'd finished mumbling my way through the most non-committal answer I could muster, he placed a gentle, reassuring hand on my shoulder. Andrew, he repeated gently, why don't you tell me what happened? I burst into tears. I told him how scared I was, how I'd fought so hard for my independence, and now I knew it would be taken from me. He listened patiently, and then asked me to tell him why I ever thought that. I paused then, took a deep breath and thought about it. This was the point of no return. But really, what other option did I have? So with tears running down my cheeks, I told Dr. Harper everything. I told him about the horse and carriage, the orange globe, and the pilgrims. I told him how I'd been living each day in fear, how I was terrified that I was losing my mind. Dr. Harper thought for a while, and then he said, Andrew, I don't think you are losing your mind. The sense of relief at that moment was so powerful it overwhelmed me, rendering me speechless. You say that even though you've seen these things, you've never heard any noise from them? Have you detected any odors or experienced any other physical sensations, such as touching them? I shook my head no, and he patted my shoulder once again. Andrew, have you heard of Charles Bonnet syndrome? He asked. Charles Bone? Who? I asked, confused by this sudden, unexpected turn of conversation. Okay, let me explain, Dr. Harper said kindly. Charles Bonnet was a Swiss naturalist who was born in the 1700s. He discovered a curious condition in his elderly grandfather, who was nearly completely blind due to cataracts. The old man regularly experienced visual hallucinations, including random patterns and even people and places. Sound familiar? Yes, I replied, still confused. Am I suffering from dementia? No, Andrew, not at all, Dr. Harper reassured me. Do you know how perception works? In layman's terms, your eyes take in light via the iris and pupil, which is then processed via the retina and translated into electrical signals, which are decoded by the brain, which simply organizes these signals into a recognizable image. With me so far? I nodded, finally starting to understand. When the retina becomes damaged, such as those that have undergone macular degeneration, those signals become warped and jumbled. Dr. Harper went on. The brain still receives them, so it does its job, translating these distorted signals into an image. It kind of fills in the gaps for you. Sometimes it fills these gaps with colors, patterns, creatures and places that aren't present. And this is called Charles Bonnet syndrome. I nearly wept with relief. So I'm not mad? I cried. Not at all, the doctor replied. This is an entirely physical condition. Your mind is in full working order. If you were suffering any form of mental illness, your delusions wouldn't be limited to just the one sense. You'd hear these interlopers, smell them, even feel them. This is a condition solely related to your eyes, not your brain. As I left Dr. Harper's office, I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Sure, my vision was still an issue, but now I knew it was only a problem with my eyes, not my mind. I knew I could handle the situation. I was ready to face the world again. Since then, I've seen plenty of weird visions. I saw a huge waterfall in the park, complete with a hazy mist and butterflies flitting about it. I saw a Native American warrior, complete with a huge feather headdress, sitting at a stool at the counter in the coffee shop. I saw an intricate and quite impossible structure of scaffolding crisscrossing the entire front of my apartment block. Hell, on the 4th of July last year, I even saw a great swooping green dragon in the sky, twisting and cavorting through the air overhead. All looked utterly and completely real, yet, now I knew they were simply tricks of the eye. They were no longer disturbing. In fact, I actually came to quite enjoy them, even looking at them as unique and entertaining little shows or works of art that existed purely for my pleasure and nobody else's. I came to welcome them. Then a month ago I saw her. It was nighttime. It's always nighttime when I see her, and I was just getting ready for bed. I walked into the kitchen to get myself a glass of water and actually cried out in alarm when I spotted the figure in the corner. She was tall, by far the tallest woman I'd ever seen, and even though she stood hunched, she still had at least 6 inches on me. I was used to seeing characters in dated and bizarre dress, but this was different somehow. It didn't seem like an outfit from any one time, instead a bizarre mishmash of items. She wore a tuxedo jacket, figure-hugging and black, tailored to the female body shape, over a dirty old ruffled dress shirt. To complete the ensemble, she wore a bright red bow tie. On her hands, which she held out to either side as if shrugging, or maybe feeling for rain, she wore dirty white gloves. Her fingers were disproportionately long, almost spidery, and occasionally they twitched, as if she longed to grip and squeeze something in them. On her lower half she wore shorts the same, crimson as her bow tie, over opaque black nylons. Her legs were long, lithe, attractive, if the truth be told, the legs of a dancer. She also wore red heels, the same hue as her shorts and bow tie, but they sparkled and shimmered, bringing to mind Judy Garland's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. As strange as this ensemble was, I couldn't tear my eyes from her face. Most of it was obscured by a jaunty bowler hat, tipped and tilted to hide her eyes and nose, but beneath the brim of her hat, I could see the deathly pale skin of her face and a grin that sent shivers down my spine. It was wide, too wide, with entirely too many teeth. A smile is meant to be an expression of warmth. It's meant to feel welcoming and benevolent. But the look on this woman's face oozed malice. It felt much like the sort of glee I'd expect from a snake as it corners a rat. However, the thing that startled me most was that she had a third arm sprouting from her back, curled up and over her head like a scorpion's tail. It was longer than any arm should be, and the hand only had 3 fingers, like a claw. It was pointed straight at me, and as I swore in dismay and stumbled sideways, it seemed to track my movement. I stood staring at the creepy figure for a few seconds, trying to get my head around the situation. She just stood there in the corner, grinning back. Finally, I realized that this was just another of my hallucinations and breathed an audible sigh of relief. One of the tricks I've picked up over the months of suffering from Charles Bonnet syndrome is to break the line of vision toward whichever stimulus is causing my brain to interpret the images into the hallucination. Think of it like restarting a faulty computer, how refreshing the system debugs it. To this end, I close my eyes and count to 5. Then, when I reopen them, the hallucination is gone. So as I stared at the horrifying malformed figure in my kitchen, I knew that to make the image go away, I simply had to close my eyes. I'll be honest here, when I counted to 5, I hesitated a little before opening my eyes. If I'd opened my eyes and she'd still been stood there, smiling that wicked smile at me, I think I might have had a heart attack. She wasn't, and I breathed another long sigh of relief, fetched my glass of water, and went back to bed. The tall woman haunted my thoughts in the days after I saw her. She was different from the other visions I'd had. Somehow she felt more real. It was this agitation that my buddy Jason picked up on when we met for lunch the following Friday. Jason was one of those same friends I'd tried to drive away shortly after I lost my vision, yet he'd refused to give up on me, continuing to get in touch week after week. Good friends are hard to come by, but great friends, the ones who will be by your side for life, are even rarer. Jason, God bless his kind heart, is one of the latter. "You've got to tell me what's going on, dude," he said as we sat down over pizza. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to brush it off. "You're so distracted, it's like you're looking for something in here all the time. You've eaten like 1 slice in pizza in the time it's taken me to eat 4. So, I repeat, you've got to tell me what's going on," Jason said, waving a slice of pizza around for emphasis. "It's nothing," I replied, feeling a little stupid. "I just had a hallucination a couple of nights ago that really got to me." "I thought you were cool with those now?" he asked, putting the pizza slice down. "Yeah, I am. I mean, I was, but this was different," I replied, resigned to talking about it. "She scared me." "She?" Jason asked, his interest clearly piqued. "Tell me about it." So I did. I described the tall woman and how she'd appeared to me. I explained that unlike any of my other hallucinations, she felt more real, and that she was the first to feature such a weird and unsettling mutation. Sure, I'd seen smaller versions of people in the past, a phenomenon referred to as Lilliputian by medical professionals, but the extra appendage and impossibly distorted face were something I had yet to encounter thus far. I think it was that, combined with the unnerving expectant stance, that had disturbed me the most. "So," Jason said after I'd finished, "you say she had great legs?" "Shut up, you asshole," I laughed, throwing my napkin at him. "No, seriously, I get it, man," Jason replied, passing the napkin back to me. "If I walked into a room and a giant mutant was waiting for me, it'd scare the shit out of me too. But you know what caused you to see this. It's like the coachman and that waterfall you saw. It's a condition that you know you have, and it's one that you know how to deal with, okay?" I know, I replied. "Thanks, man, you're right." I did feel better too, so I smiled at him, took a big bite of my pizza and changed the subject, asking him about his psycho ex, a conversation he was all too happy to dive into. The next time I saw the tall woman, just under a week later, I was brushing my teeth. I was stood at the wash basin, brushing away, when I spotted a figure in the mirror. She was out in the dark hallway, peeking around the door behind me. That same sinister grin I'd seen before stretched her narrow face into a distorted grimace, the dirty bowler hat pushed down over her eyes once again. Each of those 3 long spidery hands gripped the doorframe. As crazy as this sounds, it felt like she was trying to avoid being spotted. I cried out, spitting toothpaste foam all over the mirror, my toothbrush clattering into the basin. I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest, my breathing ragged in my throat. She wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. The doorway was empty. I tiptoed forward hesitantly, trying to look around the doorframe into the hallway without actually sticking my neck out into its shadowy confines. The seconds ticked by as I drew closer and closer. I couldn't see anything, so, finally, with a whisper of self-affirmation, I stepped out of the bathroom. The hallway was empty, as was the rest of my apartment. I was shaken again. This was the first time I'd seen a hallucination in a reflection, and I wasn't even sure that I'd actually seen it. Now as I sit here, writing this, knowing what would follow, I think I thought like that to try to protect myself, to shield myself from the truth. I was an idiot. A full fortnight passed without incident. Sure, I saw a flash of color one day, a dancing yellow lightning bolt that zigzagged back and forth on the street outside my apartment. But that was exactly the sort of thing I'd come to expect from my condition. It was exciting, otherworldly, but it wasn't scary, not like she was. In retrospect, that fortnight was blissful. It was a reminder of what life could be like, the existence that I'd carved out for myself since my diagnosis. Life was good. The night that changed the way I viewed the tall woman. Last night, I'd been out and had a couple of drinks. I'd met the other guys with visual impairment for dinner, and we'd ended up at a bar afterwards. I wasn't hammered, but we got through plenty of beer between us, and by the time I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt decidedly lightheaded. It took me a while to make it home, laughing and talking to a couple of the other guys from our group as we strolled along. It had been a great evening. It's probably the last truly good one I'll ever have. I bid the other guys goodnight and, fumbling with my key, let myself in. With swaying steps, I strolled into my hallway, slamming the door a little too loudly behind me. I took off my jacket, hung it on the hook by the door, and then hit the light switch. She was waiting at the end of the hallway, all three hands held aloft into claws, reaching for me, that same maddening, malevolent grin on her pale face. I swore again, louder than ever, actually jumping back a step, recoiling from the impossibly tall and terrifying figure lying in wait in my own home. The tall woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring and smiling at me. I stared back, but I sure as hell didn't smile. Jesus Christ, I muttered under my breath. You know how you can feel a little paranoid after a few beers? That feeling of non-specific post-alcohol dread? Imagine that combined with a giant grinning mutant woman suddenly appearing in your home. Suffice it to say, it was very, very, very uncool. I don't need this, I sighed and closed my eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When I opened my eyes, her face was just a foot from my own. Grinning wider than ever, she dashed the length of the hallway, and was now stood so close that her long, grasping arms were either side of me, her fingers twitching and clawing at the air around my face. I could see her chest heaving, as if she were actually laughing silently at my attempts to dismiss her, as if the thought that I could ever be free of her was amusing. I screamed, a full-bodied shriek of terror, and actually dropped to my knees, covering my head as if to fend off an expected blow. It never came. Finally, I lowered my hands, gasping for breath, shaking. The hallway was empty, the tall woman nowhere to be seen. I stayed there, on my knees for a moment, gasping for breath. Then I was on my feet and I turned and ran, out of the apartment, out of the building and into the street. I stood there, shivering, terrified beyond reason, without a clue as to what I'd do next. Finally, I pulled my phone from my pocket and I made a phone call. "Hey Andy, what's up?" Jason asked. "Jason, I need you to come here," I said, sobbing. Jason didn't ask why, didn't complain. Instead, he simply replied, "I'm on my way." Less than minutes later, his car pulled up outside and he dashed over to the steps outside my building where I was sitting shivering. He threw his jacket around my shoulders and asked what happened, his voice filled with concern. "She's in there," I stammered. "The tall woman, she's back." Okay, he said, gently helping me to my feet. "Come on, man, let's go in there and check it out." I wish I could say that I was brave when we went inside, but I'd be lying. I cowered behind Jason, one hand on his shoulder as we made our way through my home. Of course, we didn't find a thing. We're talking a giant mutant woman in a poky little one-bed apartment. Where the hell was she going to hide? Finally, after we'd checked every single room twice, I had to admit that she was gone. "I'm so sorry, man," I apologized, feeling genuinely stupid. "I got scared, and I'm sorry, man." "Hey, forget about it, buddy," Jason said. "So I'm here now. Where do you keep your booze?" Half a bottle of bourbon later, we were both feeling pretty talkative. "She's, just kind of different, I tried to explain. I get it, he said. "It's like you saw something bad and you feel bad. That's bad." He didn't get it. "No, she's different, I explained. "I've never had a repeat hallucination before, and they've never been scary, She's not like the others." "Dude," Jason said, taking another sip of bourbon, "you've got, Charlie Boney syndrome, and that makes you see shit, so..." He waved his hands in the air like a magician who just performed a trick. I know, I replied. "No, listen, Andy," he said. "You know it makes you see shit, it's just your eyes, yeah? You didn't hear anything, you didn't feel anything. This is how that stuff goes. It's your eyes, and I know it's scary, man, but you've been through, hell and high water in your life so far. You're tough, one of the toughest, bravest guys I know, and you can handle some creepy hallucination, bitch." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "She's a very creepy hallucination bitch, though, dude." He laughed too. We both took a drink. "That could help," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "What, drinking?" I asked. No. Well, yes, it does, he giggled. I mean, like, demystifying her. You should give her a name. Something stupid, so she's not scary. I've got say that as much as I like creepy hallucination, bitch. That's a bit of a mouthful. I laughed. Yeah, I get that, he replied. Suddenly something he'd said came back to me. How about Helen? I suggested. Helen Highwater? Awesome, he said, then raised his glass. Here's to Helen, buddy. To Helen, I smiled and drained my glass. Jason spent the night on my sofa, mainly because he'd had too much to drink to even think about getting behind the wheel of a vehicle, but honestly, I think the reason he drank so much was so he'd have an excuse to stay and keep an eye on me. I'm glad he did. Knowing that he was there made me feel safer, and I was able to get some sleep. It gave me a sense of security to know that if the strange vision I'd just christened Helen was to appear again, I'd be able to call on him for support. This morning, we both needed support. It feels like a mule kicked me in the head, he groaned when I made my way into the living room. Yep, I replied, my own head thumping. Joe's, he replied firmly and staggered to his feet. As we drank strong black coffee and ate muffins, we didn't talk much. Finally, Jason broke the silence. So, you feel cool now? He asked, his mouth still full of blueberry muffin. I nodded. Yeah, I think so. Not still freaked out about you-know-who, he asked. Helen? I replied with a smile. No, I really don't think I am. I reckon I can handle some creepy hallucination, bitch. Good, he laughed, giving me a hearty pat on the back. That's cool, man. I bet you can. Now as I sit here cowering in my bathroom, too scared to go out into my apartment, I know we were both wrong. About everything. Remember how earlier I told you that the thought of being institutionalized, that the very idea of losing my grasp on reality was the most terrifying thing I could imagine? Now I'd welcome that, because the alternative is far, far worse. After breakfast, I said goodbye to Jason, and he climbed into his car and drove away. The day passed without incident, and when Lois stopped by this afternoon, she even commented on how upbeat I seemed. You got a lady in your life? She asked casually. I laughed at that, wondered what she'd think if she knew the truth. Yeah, I chuckled, something like that. Good for you, she sniffed. You make sure you treat her right. That tickled me even more and I had to bite my lip. Sure, I replied. I'll do my best. Tonight, still a little wiped from the exertions of the previous evening, I decided to turn in early. I brushed my teeth, washed my hands and face, and got changed. Finally, I fetched a glass of water and walked into my bed. I rested my arms behind my head, skim-reading the credits of a movie I'd just watched. After seeing them through about halfway, I lifted myself from the sofa and walked to the kitchen, stretching my arms out above me. I opened the fridge door and found a full cartoon of juice, so I sat down on the kitchen counter by the window, cracked open the lid, and took several long, noisy gulps. When I couldn't drink anymore, I gasped to let in new air and wiped my mouth on the back of my hand. My evenings were uneventful around this time in summer. It was PM on a Saturday in July, school was out for the holidays, and my parents had gone to visit my aunt and uncle who lived by the coast. They would still be gone for more weeks. I declined the invitation to join them. I didn't dislike the place or my relatives, but we usually stayed there so long that I'd miss most of summer break, and I'd truthfully rather spend it with my friends in town. I was a good kid who knew how to wash clothes and use an oven, and generally not an idiot, so they let me stay at the house so long as I kept it clean. As I sat, I looked out into the garden to check for anything scary in the dark. It was empty and black. I kind of wished we had a pet. A dog or a cat would be nice about now, but their hair always made me sneeze and my eyes go red and itchy. With that in mind, my dad said no, even though I wouldn't mind it. PM, I put the rest of the juice cartoon back in the fridge door and went back over to the window. Hoisting myself onto the counter again, I glanced out to the garden and identified the shadows one by one to make sure everything was in its place. The bushes were their usual shape. 2 small trees stood together by the back fence, and a metal table with chairs sat casually on the patio. I like to check these things, which is largely why I wasn't scared of the dark. I would always get up to investigate small noises in the night, and I hated sleeping with my face to the wall. If someone was in my room at night, I'd rather know about it, so at least there was the faintest chance of getting away somehow. This meant that my worries were quickly put to rest, as I either found nothing downstairs but the radiator popping with the heat, or opened my eyes to see an empty bedroom. Not knowing what could be making the odd noises coming from the kitchen, or on the stairs, or in my room is what makes my skin creep. PM. I got down from the counter and wandered back into the living room to turn off the TV, and decided to take the rest of the juice upstairs. I went back into the kitchen, opened the fridge door and stopped. Turning my head to focus outside, I could see someone was standing in the garden. I shut the fridge door and turned off the light so they couldn't see me so easily, and moved slowly to lean on the kitchen counter to get a better look. All the doors were locked, and all the neighbors were home. I took a moment to remind myself this. Still, my heart quickened a bit as I stood there straining to see his or her shape in the darkness at the end of the garden. I had to keep glancing away to keep their fuzzy outline clear in my vision. They were standing very still, and were a little thin, but that's all I could see. I couldn't tell anything else. "Oh," I said aloud. It was the garden umbrella leaning up against the back fence. I forgot that we used it for barbecues. I smiled at myself, pleased that I didn't get too worked up, and went upstairs to my bedroom. I laid on the bed and propped my head up on a pillow, opening my laptop on my stomach to see if anybody was online. Apparently someone else was bored and saw my name pop up. "Chris, hey." "Me, hey, you okay?" "Chris, yeah, bored. Are your parents still away?" "Me, for a couple more weeks, Chris. Why don't I come round?" "Me, I don't want to be rude, but I kind of can't be bothered to hang out tonight, lol. "Thanks though, Chris." "I know what you mean, it's cool. What about tomorrow?" "Me, yeah, that sounds better, Chris. Cool, I'll be roundabout. I've got some family stuff to do in the morning, me." "Okay, Chris. Do you still have a tent, BTW? We can camp in the garden or something." "Me, aw, slumber party. I love you too, bro. Chris. Whatever. LOL. You got the tent though?" "Me? Yeah, somewhere. Let me check." BRB. I got up from my bed and headed to check the cupboard under the stairs. I didn't know where the tent was, but it seemed a good place to start. I opened the cupboard door and started shifting coats aside. Some cardboard boxes were stacked up at the back and might be hiding it, so I started unstacking them. I took out a couple of the easy-to-reach ones and had a stroke of good luck as the tent bag came into view. I leaned over the other boxes and picked up the bag and took the big garden umbrella that sat beside it too, just in case it rained tomorrow. I paused. I put the tent down. It took me a couple of seconds to get back to the kitchen window and focus on the darkness outside. My eyes weren't yet adjusted to the dark, so I couldn't see all the way to the back fence. Turning off the kitchen light, I leaned on the counter and continued staring at the same point. The other garden features began to fade into view one by one, fitting my previous mental image. I wasn't sure what I wanted to see. The darkness gave way to the familiar forms I knew, but after a while, I was certain there still stood a figure against the back garden fence. It hadn't moved. I stood there for minutes looking at it. I couldn't tell its shape properly, but it did look like someone standing there. I decided it wasn't a threat. I thought if I was in any real danger, I would have been a lot more worried by now. That thought kept me calm. But I also wanted to find out what it was. I couldn't stand there forever. I jogged upstairs, picked up my laptop, and brought it down with me to the counter. "Me, could you come round now?" "Chris, oh." "Me, yeah. I think I can see something in my garden." "Chris, what is it? An animal?" "Me, no, it's tall. I thought it was an umbrella." "Chris, and now you're sure it isn't?" "Me, I don't know. I thought it was someone, but now I'm sure it's not a person. It just looks weird, and I don't think it was there before." "Chris, before when?" "Me, I don't know. Earlier today maybe, I can't remember." "Chris, are you scared?" "Me, I'd feel better if someone else was here, Chris. Well, I did offer to come round, and I am bored." "Me, so yeah?" "Chris, yeah, I'll come soon. Me, cool. Thanks, use the front gate." I sat there watching the black shape lean against the fence for another 10 minutes. Eventually, the doorbell rang. I opened it, and Chris ran in and bear hugged me. "It's been too long," Chris mock cried. "Yeah, it must have been a whole day," I retorted, smiling. "The torment," he replied, pretending to ignore me. "Look, come over here," I said, pushing him off and walking to the kitchen. I switched off the light and pointed in the figure's direction. "Look, give me a sec," said Chris. "I can't see properly." A minute later he noticed, "That black thing?" "Yeah, We both stood there looking at it for a while. I half expected it to be gone when he looked. He leaned over the counter. "It's just a big plant or plank of wood or something. Let's go watch TV." "Will you check with me to make sure?" I asked. "Do you have a torch?" he returned. "No," I admitted. "Well, we could check if we keep the kitchen light on and open the back door a little," he offered. I thought for a second and agreed, but said we should stay right by the house. We slipped on our trainers and opened the back door. Stepping onto the patio, I felt the air was heavy and warm that night. Chris walked behind me. We stood very close to the door, peering at the back fence. "Should we?" I had just started to speak when he quickly stepped into the house again, still looking at the fence. "What?" I asked, following him in. I turned, and realized that the figure was gone. It was obvious from the light coming from the back door that the fence and the rest of the garden was just as it always was. "Where is it?" Chris said. "If it was leaning against the fence, it probably fell over into a bush or something." I tried to convince us both. We stared out for a few seconds longer and decided that we were too nervous to go and check. I don't usually give in to my night terrors, but now they were just beginning to click into my head. "Can you stay over for the night?" I asked Chris. Yeah, sure." It didn't sound like he really wanted to. He kept his eyes on the fence. We both went inside and locked the door before going up to my room. I got out a sleeping bag for Chris and drew the curtains without looking outside into the garden again. We talked about stupid stuff for a couple of hours to take our minds off the garden and fell asleep. In the morning, I found Chris's sleeping bag empty. I called out to Chris and he said he was downstairs, so I threw on a t-shirt and went down. "Sleep well?" I asked. "Yeah, pretty well, but I kept thinking about the garden and stuff." "Hey, did you find that tent?" he returned. Yeah," I answered, remembering that shape which I had forgotten about until now. "Well, I was thinking about the camping thing and thought maybe we could bring the tent to my house. It would just make a change, you know?" I didn't have to ask him why. I wasn't too keen on staying in my garden after last night. Wait, last night? Come to think of it, the sun was up and I wanted to check the garden while it wasn't pitch black. I asked Chris and he hesitantly agreed. We put on our trainers and stepped out into the garden. I don't know what we were so worried about. It was bright and colorful. The plants and bushes around the edges of the garden smelled good, and there was a bird in one of the small trees singing out for its mate somewhere. We walked to the back fence to find nothing out of place, and looked over the bushes in front of the paneling to check if anything lay behind them. We found nothing. I walked around the edge of the whole garden once more, while Chris tried whistling to the bird. It cocked its head from side to side trying to figure him out. It was a warm day, perfect for camping that evening, I decided. We talked as we filled a couple of rucksacks with sleeping bags and some food from the kitchen. We didn't want to set up a fire, so we packed some tinned hot dogs, bread, a packet of tomatoes, and chocolate, as well as some bottles of water. "There's a forest just next to my house, which is actually pretty good," Chris explained. "Our garden backs onto the edge of it. I stayed in a tent there once with my dad for my first little camping trip when I was I remember I was so excited at the time. I thought we were really roughing it like some hardcore mountaineers." Chris laughed at himself. "If we get too cold or need more food, we can just go to my house. My parents are out, so we'll have free run of the place anyway." "Yours are away too?" I questioned. "It's their anniversary, so they're out for the night," he explained. "They're staying in a hotel the next town over. They'll be back in the morning." Apparently leaving your kids behind was in fashion this summer. At about noon, we left my house with the rucksacks, a sleeping bag for each of us, and the tent, and made our way to Chris's house. It was fairly close by, and a part of the same pleasant neighborhood. We talked and joked a lot walking side by side, nodding and greeting a couple of familiar neighbors as we went. It was a crazy nice day. The sun was almost too much, it was hot on our necks, and the trees by the sidewalk seemed to glow green from underneath as the sunlight passed through the leaves. A sprinkler offered us some water as we walked by one house, and it felt good on my hot arms. I was already sweating by the time we got to Chris's place. We hadn't been walking for more than minutes. We didn't go inside his house immediately because it was so hot, so we went straight to his garden and dumped our bags in the shade. He wasn't joking. The gate of his garden backed straight onto an impressive forest. Very tall, thin trees stood high above the house and continued as far as I could see. Some bushes and shrubs littered the forest floor, but most of it was either grass or fairly smooth sections of dirt. I didn't see how this forest was classed as small. "Looks good, right?" he boasted. "It's awesome," I admitted, opening the gate and surveying the area. I walked out in between the trees and found a flat spot for the tent. I turned around to ask Chris's opinion and paused, a little disappointed. It didn't feel like real camping when his house was so obviously in our faces. "Let's go a little further in so it at least feels legit," I said, and walked back to pick up my bags. Chris objected to carrying his heavy shit any further. We walked in a straight line from Chris's house and kept checking behind us until the house was just about obscured by trees in front of each other. We had only gone a very short way in, but the forest was already thicker and greener. There was even a long rope swing hanging from one of the trees, but it looked too old to hold our weight, so we decided to keep our spines unbroken and give it a miss. I unpacked the tent and set it up with Chris's help, and we threw our sleeping bags inside. I laid down inside to test it out. It was so warm and humid I had to adjust my breathing for a second. I stepped out again and asked Chris if he had a torch for the evening. "I can do better than that," was his response, and he took off towards the house. I was too hot to run after him, so I opened my rucksack and cracked open a bottle of water, downing half of it and putting the rest back in the pack. I laid down on a patch of grass and looked up at the canopy. The leaves were shifting gently in a breeze I couldn't feel from down here, and I watched them sway and mesh together until I heard Chris return. "Did you get a torch?" I asked, closing my eyes. The sun shone through my eyelids and colored my vision red. I listened to the soft sound of his footsteps on the grass as he walked past me towards the rope swing. "That's not going to hold you," I warned, as I heard him tug the branch with a small creak. He tugged it and it creaked in response. I listened. He tugged it once more, and again. There was a moment of silence as I guessed he was still weighing it up, and then another tug. He continued to tug a few more times, and the creaking followed each one. I was sure it wouldn't hold his weight, and I smiled, predicting one big creak and a snap as the rope or the branch broke. I waited as some final tugs were made. Creak, creak. I waited still. Creak, creak, creak. "Yo!" I heard Chris's voice coming from his garden. I sat bolt upright, almost spraining my neck, as I snapped my head sideways to face his house. He was jogging through the trees holding an electric lantern. I switched my gaze in the other direction towards the rope swing. It was hanging still, nothing nearby. I stood up and turned full circle, nothing in any other direction. "What?" I mouthed to myself, walking towards the rope. I tugged it gently. It didn't creak. I pulled it harder. It didn't creak. My mouth went dry. I jumped up, grabbed hold, and yanked it down. The branch bent a little as my feet touched the floor, and still it didn't make a sound. I kept hold of it as I stared up towards the branches, but eventually the rope gave way under my weight somewhere in the middle, and a soft thud fell on my ears as the thick rope fell in front of me. Chris was rattling the lantern as he came by. "I've never used this before. I got it for Christmas from my cousin. She buys some weird presents. Ah, I see the swing is dead. Let's have a proper burial in memory of all the joy it gave us." I didn't respond. I continued looking up at the branch with half a rope swing tied to it. "Hey, are you good?" Chris followed my gaze. "I thought you'd already come back," I said immediately. I wasn't the type to let things slide with an "oh, it's nothing." "What?" he replied. "Someone walked by me and was messing around the rope swing." "Who was it?" "I don't know." "Are they still around?" "I don't know." I had my eyes closed and was laying just there, I pointed. "But then I heard you shout, so I looked around and there was nothing here. I heard them walk by my head." I felt a bit sick. "Look, calm down a second," Chris began. "It's the middle of the day, we're feet from my house, and even if it was a person, so what? It's just some public woods. Anyone can come through here." That made some sense, and he was right about it being public. But then where were they? I glanced around one more time. However, the trees quickly layered up, and I couldn't see far at all. I guessed it was possible for me to lose track of someone here in a short distance. "Okay," I said, "man, I can stay alone in the house for weeks on end, but I can't handle a short walk through the woods on a summer's day." "That's why you've brought some muscle," declared Chris, wielding the lantern above his head, and I laughed. We spent the day walking around the forest and returned to the tent to get some water when we were too hot. We talked about school and what our plans were for the future. We talked about dreams we'd had, and ghosts and creatures that lurked in the dark. Neither of us were too scared of things like that, but they made for good camping stories. Chris told a particularly good one of a woman who lived in the woods. She had the head of a cat, and if you heard her raspy meow, that meant she was trying to find you. If she stopped meowing, it signified you were found and she was quickly making her way towards you. It made my skin crawl a little, and we stopped telling stories soon after that. The light of day eventually faded, and it was getting hard to see, so we headed back to the tent for the night. The impressive heat during the day had killed our appetites, so we left the food for now and decided we'd eat it in the night if we got hungry. Chris hung the electric lantern at the front of the tent, flicking it on as he did so. It was surprisingly bright and spilled a yellow light onto the ground and onto the trees that faced us. The warm glow looked dramatic, but whatever was beyond the light was hidden in blackness. Our immediate area was clear, but after a few paces the light seemed to stop dead. It looked weird. Chris ducked under the tent opening and I followed him. The sleeping bags looked inviting as the heat from earlier had gone, and it was too cold for shirts and shorts. We got inside and took the lantern with us. "Can you hear meowing?" I said. My head tilted as I strained to hear. "Yeah, I can hear some bullshit too." Chris smiled and zipped up his sleeping bag. Damn, I thought I had him. Oh well, I zipped up my own bag and we laid there talking for a little while. And then the exhaustion of such a hot summer's hit us, and we fell asleep. I had a dream that we were walking to Chris's house again, but there were more trees than before, and it was getting dark very quickly. I blinked, and suddenly it was night, with the forest sprawling in every direction. The rope swing hung in front of me. I turned around, and Chris was gone. I heard a creak behind me. A feeling came over me like I'd missed a step on the stairs. For some reason, I couldn't turn around. I started walking straight ahead, and the rope swing soon came into my view again. I was aware I was in a nightmare. The rope swing slowly lifted itself up into the trees, and I watched it disappear. I walked over and stood beneath where it had been, and there was a rustle above me. As I lifted my eyes to the canopy, a black figure with the head of a cat came hurtling downwards with its mouth open horrifically wide. One of its teeth touched my left eye, and I tore myself awake, gasping as I sat up in the tent. My back was damp with sweat, and Chris was asleep next to me. The lantern was still on, and I could see our backpacks at the end of the tent. I took a moment to breathe, and then let myself lay back down, my head thumping on the floor a little too hard. I winced and reached for the bottle of water to my side, downing a few mouthfuls. I couldn't fall asleep with the glow of the lantern on my eyelids, so I sat up and searched the tent for it. I quickly realized the light was coming from outside. "Chris," I said, still confused from sleep. He mumbled something in reply. "Chris, where's the lantern?" Somewhere," he said slowly and sleepily before turning over. Looking around again, the light was obviously coming from outside. I weighed up the options. Either some murderer had snuck into our tent and done nothing but take the lantern outside, or we didn't actually bring it into the tent and I had remembered. Wrongly. That sounded more convincing, so I knelt by the tent door and unzipped it. From the opening I looked around. It wasn't immediately obvious where the glow was coming from. Why couldn't I see it? I looked up. The lantern was resting feet in the air, hanging in the dark. Goosebumps swept across my skin, and I zipped up the door before shaking Chris. "Chris, please wake up." He heard the urgency in my voice and sat up. "What? What's wrong?" Chris said, rubbing his eyes. "The lantern's hanging outside." "But I brought it in," he assured me. I felt sick as my reasoning broke. We both looked at the front of the tent. "We should go back to the house," I said, my resolve buckling. I was just a kid in a forest whose parents were away. "I'm not walking through the dark," he replied. Chris was now looking worried. "We've got a lantern." I stopped myself. We looked at the front of the tent again. We couldn't sit there forever. We were getting scared as we sat there doing nothing, so this was the plan. We weren't going back to sleep. We would get the lantern back somehow, leave everything here, and spend the night in Chris's house. I hated being the one to go first. I wanted to turn back even just crouching by the tent entrance. Unzipping the fabric door, I looked around. Nothing. I peered over the tent behind us. Nothing in sight. Literally nothing. Everything was black outside of the light. I took a step out, and it was cold. Chris said the same as he stood right by my side looking over his shoulder. He turned back and saw the lantern in the air. "Oh my God." We stood there looking at it for a few seconds that seemed to crawl by. Eventually, I worked out which tree it was hanging from. The broken rope swing at my feet confirmed it. Way up out of reach, the lantern hung above our heads, tied to the other end of the rope that still dangled from the darkness. I couldn't work it out. It was high up, too high up for even a ladder. The trees were thin and bare besides the leaves that made up the canopy. There was nowhere to climb. Picking up the length of rope that had snapped off earlier, I bundled it up and tied a knot, and aimed at the lantern. I took a step back and jumped, tossing it into the air. It caught the lantern on its side and sent it swinging. It threw shadows rocking around us. I suddenly wished it hadn't hit it. The light made the shadows lean from side to side with the lantern. The horrible, unnatural swaying made me panic, and my eyes became wet as fear took a solid hold of me. I picked up the rope again, and lobbed it desperately at the lantern. I missed, and the bundle of rope sailed off into the darkness. Helplessly, I turned to Chris, who had already grabbed his backpack. He span around and threw it with a yelp, and it hit the lantern dead on. It fell and thudded to the floor with a crack, but the light was still on. I ran to pick it up. I turned to Chris and almost cried with relief. "Okay, go, 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 let's go," I urged, and he started jogging quickly towards his house as I followed. We half ran, half stumbled off into the dark, checking over our shoulders, and working ourselves up as our thoughts were consumed by everything that may be waiting in the trees for us. I don't know how long we were moving, but it soon became apparent that Chris's house wasn't in this direction. "For God's sake, where is it?" Chris said, tension taking hold of his voice. "We'll have to find the tent and try again." A couple of tears were forming at the corners of his eyes. They were probably on mine too, but my heart was thumping so hard I didn't notice. "Okay." I took a breath and we turned around, heading in a straight line directly behind us. What if we didn't find the tent? I couldn't stop myself thinking that over and over as we retraced our steps. We walked for what seemed like twice as long, before the light finally fell on the side of the tent. We ran up and stood close to its side, looking around to try and figure out which direction we should go. The silence was like the buildup of a nightmare, right before some horrible thing lurches out at you, screaming. The comparison made me gag, and I scrunched my eyes shut, the hair on my skin lifting. My temples were so hot, it felt like my brain was thudding against the inside of my skull. I couldn't begin to guess where the house was. We could see about 10 feet from the lantern, and then pitch black. There were no clues. Every direction looked wrong. Chris took the lantern from me and walked in a small circle, straining his eyes to try and see. I stayed put. "Chris, turn it off." I whispered to him hurriedly. "What?" he asked. I stepped quickly and quietly towards him, bringing my face to his. "There's something in the tent." His gaze shifted past me towards the tent, and he stood there staring. We were standing on the left-hand side of the tent, and from this angle I could just about see the unzipped door hanging open, but I remembered leaving it that way. So that wasn't what was making me clench my teeth together. A few feet away, my rucksack sat outside on the dry earth, with the food I had packed now neatly arranged trailing from it. Our sleeping bags were also nicely laid out, end to end, making the line of belongings lead straight into the mouth of the tent. I took a careful step forward so the light could pass more easily through the fabric. It couldn't have been a trick of the light. Something big and dark was obviously crouched, with what I guessed was its front, facing the open door. I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. It didn't move at all, or seem to breathe. It just sat, waiting for us to investigate the display it had made. "Turn it off," I whispered again. Chris continued staring, deaf to me. "Chris," I pleaded in a whisper. A voice from nearby joined in. "Chris." We both heard it, and the blood fell in our veins. It came from the tent. A slow, strained rasp of a voice that sounded like a parrot copying a new word. The sound clicked across my skin and crept into my ears. The light flicked off with a click that was too loud. Chris grabbed my shoulder, and I clenched my fists closed, painfully tight. We stood there in complete darkness. I didn't want to move, and I didn't want to stay. My brain fought for control as my legs waited for a decision, rooted in place. We breathed shallow, quiet breaths, blackness pressing on our eyes like water. Sweat ran down my neck. I couldn't see the tent. "Chris," something said. "Turn it oof." My stomach flipped inside out as the thing in the tent played with my words. I quickly grabbed Chris's hand, yanking him in the opposite direction. I ran like I never had before, Chris's legs thudding alternately with mine. The sprint continued for about a minute. We lost ourselves as we ran through absolute darkness. I forgot where we were, and I couldn't see what was in front of my face. I ran head-on into a tree, and my forehead struck its side with a sickening, hollow knock. Sparks lit up inside my eyes as I chalked back the pain. It hurt so much I couldn't breath. Chris tried to pull me on, but I buckled to the floor on my knees and threw up. As I collapsed onto my back, my head went numb. Chris lifted me up. "Please don't stop, please, please," he begged. I couldn't reply. "Please, please keep going." I forced my legs to take my weight as I locked my knees upright, leaning on Chris. My body felt empty and a little blood rolled down my forehead and into my brow. I wiped it away as I tried to grasp the situation again, but the pain was too much. "Wait, I can't," I begged. "Just wait, just wait." We stood together in the inky woods, but we could have been anywhere. I couldn't see Chris as he huddled next to me. It didn't feel like darkness. It felt like someone had wrapped my head in a blanket. Neither of us said a word as we waited, but our breathing was loud, and I wondered from what distance it could be heard. Reality began to return to me, and the pain was now just about bearable. I straightened up, grasping at what was happening. The pins of fear sank into me a second time, and I started counting in my head. 1 minute passed without any sound in the world. The wind was dead, and the birds might be too. Another minute went by. I continued counting. 3 minutes. We were still alone. Was it even looking for us? I reached for Chris's arm in the dark. He jumped when I touched it, but I steadied him with the other. He was still holding the lantern. Good. We had light on our side. Now if only we could use it. I went over the events hurriedly in my mind. The lantern was hanging from a tree. We got out of the tent, then couldn't find our way home. By the time we returned to the tent, something was in it. But then why did it take the lantern and do nothing while we slept? If it was sheer luck that we were alone when we were trying to get the lantern, I wondered just how small the possibility was of us getting a second chance. I stayed silent for a moment and then whispered as best I could, "Chris, we need to turn on the lantern. We need to fucking get away from here. We can make a run for your house, but we need to see." "No, please, we have to stay here." Chris tried to whisper too. "We can wait for morning if we have to. You can't turn it on." I could hear in his voice that a sob was breaking through. "Just keep quiet. You fucking have to, please." I parted my lips to try again, but as I did, I heard something. A very faint clicking sound from somewhere in the dark. It was almost inaudible, but it was there. An irregular, stuttering, clicking sound. It sounded fingernails on a wooden table, and was moving. It came from in front of us. I was sure of it. A steady click, clack, click filled my ears as we tried gauge the distance. It was drawing closer. Click, click, clack. It stopped. I was glad for the first time in my life that I couldn't see what was waiting in the dark. Perhaps that meant we were also hidden. As my thoughts fired off in every direction, I gave the thing in the darkness the image of the cat-headed woman, and it terrified me. I was just waiting to hear that meow. But my ears were met with something else. "Chris." I tensed my throat and tried not to cry. "Chris." It said his name twice, and I cupped my hand over my mouth. The horrible scraping dialogue sounded a few steps away. The words were said oddly, with no meaning behind them. They were just sounds that this thing had picked up, and was now using them to catch us out in the dark. Chris let go off my hand, and I heard his foot plant softly on the grass behind him as he prepared to run. "Don't you dare." I tried to project into his mind. "Don't you make a sound. Chris, please." It sounded so wrong, drawn out like a door slowly opening. Chris let out a whimper as it called him. I froze and waited for something, anything to happen. There was a long silence, and I held my breath for as long as I could. I couldn't wait anymore. Very slowly I reached out to Chris and put my hand on his shoulder, and very carefully we both lifted our feet and managed to step without making a sound. We back-stepped away from the voice and didn't stop moving, but ever so carefully. So slowly. I didn't care how long it would take us to get somewhere. If it took us an hour every step, we were going to get out. Chris backed into a tree and gasped audibly. The clicking started up immediately. Click, click, clack, click. It rolled on, consistently moving towards us. I didn't know what to do. All I could think of was to screw my eyes shut and try not to scream. As we stood there, the clicking came to a stop an arm's length away from where we stood. Silence. "Chris, turn it on, please." Fear took over. Chris switched on the. Paul pulled the envelope out of his leather attaché case and settled into an uncomfortable chair behind a large writing desk. Late afternoon sun filtered in through the bay window but couldn't defeat the dankness of the old house, nor the dreariness of his mood. Luckily, he had had the mind to pack a few battery-powered lanterns, and one of them now provided enough illumination to examine his mother's ornate handwriting on the back of the envelope. For Paul, it read. He traced the letters with his fingers, each one written with care and love. Pensively, he squeezed the bridge of his nose and released an exhausted breath. He had admittedly taken the loss of his mother very hard, as she was a kind, bright, thoughtful woman taken way before her time. But he was a lucky man, and had married a woman who exuded those same qualities and had been blessed with a daughter whose genes seemingly came from the women in his family. He had received the envelope several weeks before at the allocation of Mother's will. Its content undoubtedly was a letter, most likely full of sage advice and love. He had agonized over opening it, though, as he was unable to come to terms with reading his mother's final words, but his wife, Lauren, had finally convinced him that they might provide comfort rather than sadness. With final resolve, he retrieved a dusty letter opener from the desk and began to read the handwritten letter. "To my dearest Paul, there are not enough words in the dictionary to express my love for you, Lauren, and your sweet baby, Emily. I only hope that I have shown you that love over your 25 years of life. My health may be fading, but know that I will always be with you, and that I'm sorry for what I'm about to reveal to you. I fear, though, that there isn't enough forgiveness on God's green earth for what I've done. If you are reading this, That means that my final will and testament have been executed, and you are probably surprised to find that you are now the owner of a small farmhouse in Creekside, Pennsylvania. It is the house that I grew up in. Heed my words, Paul. Do not go to that house. Put the deed in the back of your safe, claim it as an asset, but otherwise forget that it exists. You may be curious to see the childhood home of your mother, but please do not go to that house. I'm going to tell you why, Paul, and you may not have the same respect for me afterwards, but it is imperative that you understand the gravity of the situation. My parents and I had moved from that house when I was around 15 to live with Aunt June. However, when I was a few years younger than you are now, fresh out of college, I was offered a teaching position at a school a few towns over from that childhood home. You know, my parents both passed away shortly after we had moved to California, and now I'm telling you that they too had left me that house in their will, but they never provided me with the knowledge I'm about to bestow upon you. My poor, sweet Paul. Out of convenience, I moved into the house several weeks before summer ended. The town hadn't changed much. It was still secluded, surrounded by forest, and its residents were still fairly strange and private. They did remember who I was, though, and they definitely remembered the accident that caused my family to leave. As I was buying some groceries, the woman behind the counter recognized me and told me that I shouldn't have come back and strongly suggested that I should turn around and leave right then and there. She grabbed me by the hand forcefully to express her urgency. There was a scar on her arm, just like the one I bear, the one I told you I got from falling off of my bike as a little girl. I was admittedly a little freaked out, but not enough to take her advice. That whole town is a little kooky, and at the time I thought I was being shunned for what happened when I was a teenager. But there was a fearfulness in her tone that has sat with me all these years. The house had remained untouched for years, and I spent that first day cleaning a thin film of dust off of everything. I was exhausted by nightfall, and feeling that it was awkward to sleep in my parents' old bedroom, I opted for my old one on the first floor. Because my room was small, my bed was flush against the wall, partially covering the only window in its length. A dresser and vanity were against the parallel wall. I remember collapsing into that bed that night, my body aching from moving boxes and cleaning. I'm not sure what initially woke me up that night, Paul. I don't recall a noise that pulled me from slumber, but I was overwhelmed by a feeling that I was not alone. Moonlight through the window cast shadows, but after a quick scan, I knew the room was devoid of life save for me. And then I saw it. In the vanity mirror, a reflection of the window, and looking in through the window was a creature that should not exist. That cannot be from this world. Too horrible for words. Just know, Paul, that this thing was evil. Even in the pale light you could see the vile intentions in its inky eyes and snarling fanged mouth. It looked excited and hungry, its gray hands pressed against the glass, each elongated alien finger leaving a filmy residue behind as it dragged its claw-like nails down the window. My back was turned to it, my feet only a few inches away from its face, separated by a thin plane of glass. I watched it feverishly watch me through the mirror. Unable to tell if it was aware that I knew it was there, I nonetheless felt like it was waiting for me to move. I, however, was frozen with fear. Honestly, if something by the grace of God hadn't stirred me from my sleep, the sound of its screeching nails would have woken me. I was able to quell a surprised reaction and remain still. Maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours, but the thing finally left. I'd be lying to you if I told you that was the first time I ever saw it, though. I'm so sorry, Paul. There are 3 creeks that run parallel in the woods that surround the town, a few miles apart from one another. Of all the rules given to us children of Creekside, the most important one was that we were not allowed to pass the second creek, and we were strongly urged not to venture too far past the first one. My parents told me there were old foundations and wells that made it dangerous for us kids to play there, and that several children had gone missing in the woods. But it was apparent that the adults of town never crossed the second creek either. A few people who had risked getting close to the second creek claimed they had seen ghosts amongst the trees, and that lore alone was enough to convince us kids to stay close to town. My best friends growing up were Jimmy and Andy. Jimmy, you know, would later become your father, but Andy was always a bit of daredevil and troublemaker, and I was an impressionable young girl. One day, Andy has stolen a few of his dad's cigarettes, and the 3 of us went into the woods like a bunch of stupid hardasses to smoke them. Andy got the crazy idea that we needed to rebel even more and explore the woods past the second creek. Jimmy and I were scared, for it had been so ingrained in us to never do it, but Andy was persuasive. Andy crossed the ancient-looking bridge over the second creek first, cigarette in mouth. Jimmy and I delayed across from him. It became clear that Jimmy wasn't going to do it. He threw a rock at Andy, called him an idiot, and started walking up the path towards town. I begged Andy to come back with us, and I must have thrown my head back in frustration when he teased me. That's when I saw it. The gray gargoyle-like creature. It was perched in a tree, not too far away from where Andy was standing. It looked like a vulture eyeing its prey. I had barely started to scream when it leapt from the tree and tackled Andy to the ground. Jimmy ran back to my side, but neither of us had any idea what to do, let alone how to comprehend the fear. I could hear Andy screaming and fighting, and I swear, Paul, that sound has never left my ears. I grabbed a rock and ran across the bridge. I hit the thing over the head, but it swiftly knocked me back into the water. I struggled, but Jimmy pulled me out on the other side, just in time to see the creature make off with Andy's limp body through the trees. I don't know how long Jimmy and I sat there in shock, but the stars were out when we reached my house. We told our worried parents and the other adults who had gathered there our story. All of them seemed more shocked that Andy and I had crossed the creek than by descriptions of the creature. Jimmy's mom let out a cry of relief when she realized her boy had not crossed. But my parents started packing up loose belongings and clothing hastily. We left town that night and drove the whole way Aunt June's, only stopping once outside of Chicago. My parents died only 6 months later, from a disease that doctors couldn't identify. I was young and didn't understand. Everything was a blur, and I couldn't discern one emotion and memory from another. At some point, I started believing that Andy had fallen in the creek and hit his head on a rock, and that my parents' passing was an awful coincidence. It was easier to cope that way. And then I saw that hideous face in the window, like it had claimed me nearly a decade before and had been waiting for me ever since. I was relieved when it left, but fearful, for I did not know where it had gone. I remained frozen the rest of the night. Early the next morning, a knock came from the front door. I hesitated, gripped again by fear, but it was Jimmy. A nostalgic reunion was halted by his urgency to discuss something with me. I knew what it was before he even sat at the kitchen table. I wasn't prepared for what he was about to tell me, though, Paul. I'll spare you the details and tell you only what you need to know. This thing that lives in the woods has been there for a really long time, Jimmy says, far before the original settlement of Creekside. Nobody knows exactly where it came from or much else about it, only that it was responsible for the vicious deaths of many of the town's children. It likes young blood, Jimmy told me. Nobody could figure out a way to kill it either. But the thing was conniving and sentient and realized that if the people left, its food would too. On the other hand, the townspeople feared that wherever they went, the creature would follow. So a deal had been made in blood. Anything that moved between the oval the second and third creek created belonged to the creature, and in turn, the creature would never harm anything that didn't cross that boundary. Jimmy told me I belonged to the creature because I had crossed the bridge, and my parents had been killed because they betrayed the pact. You see, Paul, it's a curse. I know it's hard to believe. It didn't take me long to make the decision to leave Creekside again. Jimmy didn't know definitively what geographically bound the creature, but had done enough research to estimate that it only traveled within the confines of Creekside and nearby townships. He had also discovered similar tales of creatures around the world. These things are all over the place, and I'm sorry, Paul, this is not important now. Check the files within your father's study. They'll tell you more than you need to know. Don't delve too deep, though. It was his obsession with it that cost him his life, not the car accident I lied to you about. I'm so sorry. Jimmy helped me throw a few boxes into my car and promised to meet me again soon. I turned around one last time to share a moment of silent solitude with him before I got in my car. As I turned back, I could see terror transform his face. He called my name, but I didn't have appropriate time to react. The creature bounded from the woods and leapt to the roof of my car. It crouched, dropping its face to be even with mine. Sneering, its rancid breath smelled of dried blood. My knees weakened and buckled as Jimmy swooped in to tackle the thing off of the roof. Jimmy fought with all his might but wasn't a match, and ended up crumpled a few feet away from me. In hysterics, I tried to flee but quickly found I had nowhere to run. The thing caught me promptly and dragged me into the woods with little effort. Jimmy composed himself enough to start running after us, screaming for me to make a deal. I lost consciousness before I could make sense of what Jimmy was telling me. A fleeting memory of Andy whispering in my mind, "Paul, please remember how much I love you," as you struggle to manage the final parts of my story. A small fire blinded me as I awoke on cold, damp ground, surrounded by trinkets of times gone by. An old wind-up children's toy, A few dog collars, Andy's engraved lighter, bones were littered everywhere. The creature sat squat across from me, watching me zealously. It was muttering anxiously and rocking on its wolfish feet. I was surprised, as ancient as Jimmy told me this thing was, to find that it spoke English. "Spoiled," it said gravelly. "You spoiled." I remember its coal eyes following me as I nervously brought myself to a sitting position. I knew it was you. Too old now, spoiled. I seemed to be in a cavern of some sort with two tunnels that faded to blackness, neither discernible as the exit. I haven't forgotten its words, nor the look in its eyes when it stopped rocking. "You can't leave. You are mine. You belong to me. You crossed the water. But you are too old to eat. You spoiled." Realizing the thing was contemplating over whether to kill me or not, Jimmy's screams strained through my head. And I understand that he had meant for me to make a deal with the creature for my life. The creature liked to bargain. So I asked it, Paul, what it wanted in exchange for letting me go. It thought a while, before it smiled maliciously. It wanted one of my children, and one of my children's children. I wondered if this thing had been around long enough to inspire Rumpelstiltskin. I don't know, Paul, but I took that deal. I nodded my head, and agreed that when I had children, I would bring one of them to the creature, and if I had grandchildren, I would sacrifice one of them as well. It might seem like a rough bargain, but it would get two for letting one go. You might be sickened now, Paul, but realize that after considering the offer thoughtfully, I simply intended to just never have children. I resolved to give up becoming a mother. I thought I had tricked it. The creature took my hand, cutting its claw deep into my forearm, creating a brand that would bond me for life. Then it simply let me go. Jimmy, and several others he had gathered, waited at the bridge. None of them asked me how I survived, for they all knew by the scarlet letter on my arm. As you know, Jimmy would leave Creekside and settle with me near Aunt June in California. On good conscience, I couldn't sell the house and put another family in the vicinity of that evil thing. I had become resigned to the fact that I had to abandon the opportunity of motherhood, but could never bring myself to permanently and medically destroy the chance of pregnancy. I just couldn't do it, Paul, and Jimmy and I were careful, even after we married. But several years later, I became pregnant with you, and your twin brother, Andrew. I know that's a shock. I'm not proud of what I did, Paul, and I regret never telling you about your brother. I knew, though, that the creature would take me, as it did my parents, if I betrayed our deal. The scar on my arm burned long before I gave birth to you. I took that baby, Paul, that infant, only a few days old. I took him back to Creekside and left him on the other side of the bridge on the second creek. I am unworthy of forgiveness, and to this day, the memory induces nausea and unbearable heartbreak. It was an evil thing for me to do, but it let me watch you grow up into the man you are. I've given you every ounce of goodness I could, and that's why I'm dying, Paul. I knew Lauren was with child a month before you announced it because the scar on my arm was on fire, reminding me of my dues. I can't pay them this time. I can't do that to you, or sweet Emily. I have lived my life, and only hope that I can be reunited with your father and Andrew on the other side. I fear that my actions have provided for more insidious consequences, however. I will repeat my initial warning, Paul. Do not go to that house in Creekside. Only evil waits there. I can't bear to imagine if the creature is able to reach Emily, our sweet, sweet Emily. I love you, Paul, with my whole heart. I am so sorry, but do not deserve your forgiveness. Mom. Paul put the letter down on the writing desk. He could distinguish disturbed and disgusted emotions amongst a primal fear and sadness. He couldn't categorize and understand his thoughts. He was unable to tell if these emotions were targeted towards his mother or himself. His mother had made some awful and anguishing decisions, sure, but he probably should have read the letter before he brought his wife and daughter to this place. Suddenly, his mother's childhood house seemed a little darker. Dazed, he tried desperately to grasp the connotations of his mother's letter. The sound of glass smashing broke his stupor, the sounds of glass shattering, the ferocity of his wife's screams, and the fading wail of his daughter's cries.